behalf of Professor Arindam Banerjee, Chair of Research and Publications, and Professor Pawan Mamedi, in Business Policy, studying Law and Governance, I'd like to, like us all, I am committed to welcome Professor Pratiksha Baxi from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is going to be speaking on Public Secrets of Law, Rape Trials in India, which is her book that has been recently published. Professor Baxi holds a doctoral degree in sociology from Delhi School of Economics, and her doctoral work is an ethnographic study of rape trials in a court in Gujarat that brings together her interest in sociology of law, feminist theory and violence. She teaches sociological perspectives of law and legal dimensions of governance, and she teaches other courses like Enculturing Law, Law, Governance and Violence, Gender Perspectives, and she anchors the Law and Social Science Research Network. So without further ado, Mr. Pratiksha Baxi.
Thank you very much, Navdeep and Pawan, not here, but sorely missed, for inviting me. This is the first time I've come to IIM, and it is a great pleasure and a great honor. So I'm going to be talking around my research, which I did in Ahmedabad in between 96 and 98, which was many, many years ago, and I'm coming back to Ahmedabad after 15-16 years, so it's an added pleasure. But I returned with my book Public Secrets of Law, Rape Trials in India. The book is based on an ethnography I did in a court in Ahmedabad city, the Rural District Sessions Court in Mirzapur, and I followed rape trials. I followed 6 cases, wrote about 4, and did archival work until 2011-12. And the book has 6 chapters, and I'm going to sort of flag some of these chapters, but going to talk about one chapter in greater detail. So as we know, the law was changed by the Criminal Law Amendment Act in April 2013, following unprecedented protest in the aftermath of the brutal gang rape and subsequent death of a 23-year-old woman on 16th December 2012. As the details of the brutality on the young woman and her male friend hit the media, it seemed as the threshold of violence, of toleration of sexual violence, had finally broken down. No longer confined to women's movement or the queer movements, rape was talked about by everyone publicly and privately across generations. The political invitation to imagine spaces of freedom from sexual violence resounded in the streets of Delhi in the winter of 2012 and 2013. I don't know how many of you have participated in street protests against sexual violence, but in Delhi it was just a truly exceptional experience. State response ranged from police action directing water cannons and batons at protesting crowds in the heart of the capital to staging spectacular performances of law reform. For the first time, everybody was talking about what is generally known but usually not spoken about, and that's why we think of rape as a public secret, that it's something which everybody knows about but we don't talk about it. Brutal gang rape, mutilation of bodily parts, and intolerable sexual humiliation in public spaces could not be confined to zones of emergency inscribed to the bodies of Dalit, tribal, religious or sexual minorities, some place out there which did not really hurt us. So it was no longer, you know, like a riot, a state of exception. We were not hurt by that. This time people seemed to be hurt. There was an unparalleled circulation and outpouring of affect or emotion. We saw the emergence of many kinds of publics during these protests. There was the emergence of a public in solidarity, which has inspired, provoked and supported each one of us in our determined fight against sexual violence. We saw the emergence of a public intimately engaged in the project of judicial reform. These protests transformed the discursive and juridical landscape by pointing to the need to do justice to those who reveal the public secret of rape. There were many speeches and writing against the emergence of what we can call the retributive public. When the cry for death penalty or castration became the vocabulary of protest. So you must have heard that the standard response to sexual violences, death penalty, or this time castrate them. Yet there was also a shift from the focus on forming a retributive public to moving towards a passionately reasoned and informed public on what the government needs to do to be accountable to rape survivors. The anti-death position reasoned that while death penalty is a symptom of collective grief and anger, capital punishment has not produced any effect of deterrence. There is already capital punishment. It was there in the law, but it has not produced any deterrence. And then judges are prone to reduce the sentence if death penalty is legislated. Out of court settlements are routine, so there is a possibility that more women will be killed, mutilated, burned, or terrorized after sexual assault if all rape cases were to attract capital punishment. The protesters critique the fact that law and society blames rape survivors for provoking the violence. So we critiqued victim blaming assertions which assert that women who wear provocative clothes, or if we smoke, or if we go out after dark, travel alone, that we invite rape, yeah? Or that most rape survivors are lying and vengeful creatures. So it was pointed out that rape is not the fault of a survivor, yet she is blamed for provoking rape. And in order to avoid the stigma attached to the word rape, many rape survivors hesitate to complain or even name what happened to them as rape. So, a number of women do not recognize the fact that force in marriage is marital rape. This is a problem of naming. So, in this sense, it's the foundational form of censorship at the level of the word and the world. The protesters argued that surely we must stop using the language of shame and honor. For example, phrases like izzat loot gayi, izzat lootna, to describe rape. The protesters demanded that our judges must stop directing rape women to marry the accused, since our judiciary believes that a rape survivor, or indeed women, have no future if they are not married. So, if no man wants to, and no man would want to marry a rape woman according to them. And that's a very prevalent position in society as well. Protests focused on abandoning the idea that rape reduces women to living corpses. So I don't know if you watched that video which was uploaded on this blog Kafila on Zinda Lash. If you haven't, just Google it and see, it's a very nice video. To insist on death penalty because rape reduces women to living corpses means that we deny survivors the means to live a life of dignity on their own terms. In other words, these protests indicated that we must seek revolutionary transformation in every sphere to inaugurate new ethical and political meanings in our collective struggle against sexual violence, and source the vocabulary of protest from languages of suffering rather than languages of power. Languages of power, of course, dictated darker responses to anti-rape protests. There was also the formation of the pornographic public, which was titillated by such rape talk, or the other standard responses to trivialize rape. So, protests, research, writing against rape typically have been seen as women's issues, producing nervous laughter, if not outright sexist jokes. And you probably remember all that stuff around painted and dented and etc., all the kind of sexist remarks made by the parliamentarians at the height of the anti-rape protests. It is also not unknown for women who speak against rape to be charged with doing indecent work, to be treated as loose and their work seen as a provocation. So when I started my research in the District and Sessions Court in Mirzapur for nearly 2 years, 96 to 98, I met kind of similar responses. The very project of researching rape trials typically produces social anxiety or even excitability. When I asked lawyers why is it so problematic, because they kept saying, why are you researching this, we can't talk to you about it. They said, you are an unmarried woman, we cannot talk to you about this, this is very indecent, we can't be free with you. So there was a range of such responses, and people literally refusing to discuss even the nature of rape trials with me. One lawyer said to me, you should not do this work. You see, your work will affect you. You will see variety of men in the court. It will have a psychological effect on you. Meaning to say you are unmarried now, you will never want to marry any man if you pursue this project. But I must assure you that's not the reason why I have not got married. For him, talking about rape did not offer any possibilities of transformation. A woman clerk in the Gujarat High Court also scolded me. Why are you researching rape trials? She said, women should not do work like this. It is only when you have misconceived ideas about bringing change that you do work like this. So she was very vehement that researching or talking against rape, we cannot change the rape cultures that colonize our courts. And she believed that it was dangerous for women to reveal the public secret of rape, because then more men would harass you. So in my book I have argued that public secrecy finds revelation, specific kind of revelation in rape trials in India, which does not bring justice to a rape survivor, but addresses and reinforces deeply entrenched phallocentric notions of justice. It remains a public secret that rape trials inscribe extreme indignity and humiliation on women's and children's bodies. Such active not knowing describes the operations of public secrecy that fail to do justice to rape survivors when they reveal their stories in courts of law. Now, every lawyer, once you interview them, knows that women's testimonies are distorted, disciplined, misrepresented in rape trials. And I would often hear defense lawyers talking amongst themselves, and they talk about cases, discuss cases with each other, sometimes boastfully, about how they succeeded in converting a rape testimony into a narrative of consensual sex. So they managed to terrify the rape survivor so much. And judges also know that courtroom talk in rape trials typically titillates, excites and provokes. So there's a lot of laughter, lewd comments and so on. So they all know it, they all participate in the production of this kind of context. Now all of this flows from an understanding of rape as sex. In law and society, rape has been understood as an outcome of pathological male lust rather than power, or as a crime committed by men against other men on their women's bodies. Rather than think of rape as a violation of women's integrity or their sexual autonomy, rape definitions in law historically can be traced to the construction of women as the property of men. Now, in the psychopathological model, rape is constructed as an act of aberrant lust, pathological sexual desire, or an isolated form of sexual deviancy. With Brown-Miller's work, I don't know if you've read it, if you haven't, please do, influential work, rape came to be seen as a preferred form of political violence against women. So men prefer to rape women rather than use some other technique of violence for subjugation, right? And women are targeted. So in that sense, it is a tool of patriarchy rather than male lust. Rape was defined as normal mode of exerting patriarchal power as intentional and premeditated political violence. And now it's established that rape is not isolated, it's not aberrant, it's not pathological. Stranger rape is a myth. Most rapes happen. If you look at crime in India statistics by men who know you or in the family. And biological and evolutionary theories which I've researched recently, which try to look for a rape gene or which have a biological basis to the question why do men rape, have been critiqued for not only essentializing masculinity, but with the argument that if you characterize a behavior as unchangeable, that amounts to inciting rape. And by representing rape as an act of pathological male lust or consequence of natural sexual difference between men and women, is neither regarded as an act of political violence nor seen as set as a scene of historical discrimination. Now we turn to, the rape law was first enacted in 1860 by the British. It was changed for the first time in 1983 in independent India. But until 2013, for more than 150 years, Indian law defined rape as the penile penetration of the vagina without a woman's consent or against her will. Now, the law, which was amended in 2013, mandated that complete and partial, so until 2013, the requirement was that complete or partial penile penetration has to be established in a court of law for a judge to determine a finding of rape, right? And rape by metonymic substitutes like sticks, fingers, in Gujarat tells us swords were used, inserted in women's vagina, and so on and so forth. Other objects, they did not in law constitute rape until 2013, right? So there was a heteronormative emphasis on rape, which may be this heteronormative emphasis may be linked to the way in which patrilineal descent is traced in society, to which control of female sexuality is essential. So basically the argument which I am trying to make is that the rape law has been used so far to regulate women's sexuality rather than address the bodily autonomy of all women, right? The law produced a high threshold of toleration of rape. So all forms of heterosexual rape, even heterosexual, forget other kinds of rape against men and transgendered people, all forms of heterosexual rape of women were not criminalized. So an underage girl, so age of consent, you can't consent to sex under 16, but if you are married, you cannot withhold consent from your husband after you turn 15. So if you marry as a child, your rights get diminished, yeah? And there is no provision for adult marital rape. So even with child rape of children in marriage, there is this kind of lack of recognition. And they even reduced, in 83, they even reduced the punishment which they would be given to a husband who would rape his child wife between the age of 12 and 15. I won't go into other details of the 1983 amendment for lack of time, but I'd say that it's fair to argue that the 1983 amendment did not result in a jurisprudence which reflected the idea that rape is an act of sexualized power, a conscious mechanism through which patriarchy maintains its domination. Indian judges do not share the view that rape is a form of political domination of women, and instead of symbolizing its breakdown, rape maintains phallocentric social order. So it is not a breakdown of social order, rather it maintains a patriarchal social order. Veena Das argues that judicial interpretation of rape lies at the intersection of the regulatory discourses of sexuality and alliance. So when she looks at judgments and how judges interpret rape cases, she finds that judges classify women into those who can be integrated into structures of alliance as distinct from women who are found habituated, loose, easy virtue. In other words, judges regularly divide women into good women and bad women, right? And if bad women, it's like a very loose, it's like whatever they think is a bad woman, whatever. One of the most damaging provisions of colonial law was the past sexual history clause. For those of you who don't know what the past sexual history clause was, it said, and I quote, when a man is prosecuted for rape or an attempt to ravish, it may be shown that the prosecutrix was of generally immoral character. This was instituted in 1860 and it was repealed in 2002. Yet what this clause did was it introduces the past sexual history of the woman. So they say, oh, she's of a loose character, she had affairs earlier, she didn't live with her husband, whatever. And they'd use that in order to disqualify the woman's testimony and turn the testimony of rape into a narrative of consensual sex. Even after the deletion, and this is what I want to show you in this paper, past sexual history continues to inform the jurisprudence of rape, especially through medico-legal techniques. Now, I just want to go back to the moment in the 1980s and 1983 when the law changes for the first time. And it changes because of a case, or the case of Mathura. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Mathura open letter or the Mathura case, but this was a 16-year-old tribal victim whose testimony was dismissed by the Supreme Court, and she was called a shocking liar by the Supreme Court in 1979. So what happens in this case? In 1972, Mathura's brother files a criminal complaint against Mathura's lover. So she used to work in somebody's house as a domestic and she was going out with somebody, and her brother doesn't like it. So he files a case of rape, abduction in the local police station. So she's asked to, she's produced in this police station, and two cops assume that because she's having an affair and her family has abandoned her, she's open to rape. So they drag her off to a loo and they rape her. When she emerges, then a crowd gathers around the police station, and finally a FIR is lodged. Now the Sessions Court acquits the policeman and says that Mathura was a shocking lawyer and her testimony was riddled with falsehood and improbabilities, and that she was habituated to sex, and that there is a world of difference between sexual intercourse and rape. This goes up to the Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court, where they say no, we find the policeman guilty, and they say that while there is a world of difference between sex and rape, the Sessions Court had not appreciated the difference between consent and passive submission. So there was an earlier judgment of the 50s where the court had said that consent is an act of reason that is free and voluntary, and not it's something induced by terror. So if you are in a police station, how the hell do you resist, right? I mean, because the cops are supposed to, so it's a kind of, so the court held that a mere act of helpless resignation in the face of inevitable compulsion or a passive giving in, when your volition is clouded by fear and vitiated by duress, cannot be thought of as consent. And the lower court has erred in its judicial interpretation of consent, and passive submission cannot be thought of free and voluntary consent. The Supreme Court overturns this and frees the accused and basically upholds this view that Mathura was a habituee and she was not believable. So 4 law professors, Upendra Baxi, Lotika Sarkar, Vasudha Dhagambar and Raghunath Kelkar. We lost Vasudha Dhagambar a few weeks ago and Lotika Sarkar a year ago. They were all law professors in Delhi and then Pune, who wrote a letter to the Supreme Court, and this is what is known as a Mathura open letter, which inaugurates the, subsequent to this letter, there is a whole, the autonomous women's movement is born, and there's a 3-year-long kind of struggle against violence against women. And you must remember at this time judicial activism isn't born, so the court is scandalized that these law professors are publishing this kind of an open letter in newspapers all over India and abroad. The open letter questioned the judicial interpretation of consent and said, does the court believe that Mathura was so flirtatious that even when her brother, her employer and her lover were waiting outside the police station, she could not let go of the opportunity of having fun with 2 policemen, and that too in the area adjoining a police latrine? Does it believe with the sessions judge that Mathura was habituated to sexual intercourse to such an extent? Now, what is the Mathura case is highly relevant to us even today. It brought into attention how past sexual history has been used to discredit the rape victim and marked the beginnings, as I said, of the first national protest against rape in India. Far from fading into insignificance, the past sexual history continues to inform the structure of rape trials today. The Mathura case raises many issues. One of them, as I flagged, was the regulation of sexuality. In my book, there are 2 chapters on how, both in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, cases, through Ahmedabad cases, and in the rest of the country, how the rape law is used to regulate women's sexuality. So, if you run away, you have a love affair, the family, police, whosoever brings a case of rape, abduction, kidnapping, theft, and there may be other provisions if they get more creative against you. If you agree to, so in one case which I documented, the woman, she was 17 and a half and she was in a relationship of good love, as the prosecutor called it later. So she was not having sex with him, but she was going out with him. So her parents kind of filed this case against her, and she decided that she is not going to leave her partner, right. So the police filed a case against her for abating her own rape and kidnapping, and also filed theft cases against her, and she went to jail for 9 months. So, yeah, and she ultimately married this man. So, it was very strange to encounter very powerful stories of love alongside these very distressing stories of violence. But that's one way in which the rape law, the social aspect, the sociological aspect of the rape law. And in Mathura, as in other cases, it's the family which puts the woman at risk of custodial violence. So, in 83, India perhaps is the only country, I am not sure if it's the only country in the world, but certainly one of the first to have invented this category of custodial rape to describe rape by policemen, right. And then now it's sort of extended to the army and rape against pregnant women. Any situation of custody, there is a long list of what constitutes aggravated rape. The Mathura case also raised the issue of vulnerability faced by Dalit and tribal women. And now in 89, we had the Prevention of Atrocities Act, and there is very specific ways in which rape is read in relation to the Atrocity Act, which I have also analyzed in one of my chapters. But what I want to do today is, I am not sure if you are interested in colonial history or law and medicine, but to flag some of the archival research I did around the sexualized nature of rape trial and how that colonial history continues to impact the way in which trials are conducted today. So, the structure of the rape trial, it foundationally differs from other kind of criminal trials. The rape trial is a sexualized spectacle designed to frame the survivor's testimony as a pornographic vignette. The rape survivor, positioned as a bystander in a case between accused and the state, experiences the trial as Kafkaesque. In the rape trial, there is a contestation between the state is represented by the public prosecutor and the accused represented by the defense lawyer. So, the rape survivor is positioned as a injured witness. The state prosecutor is her lawyer, right. Now, the critique of the discourse of shame and honor is very important in the organization of the rape trial in India. Women perceive their own bodies often as shameful, such that naming one's sexual parts is considered to be shameful. It's not, you don't usually use these words in public spaces. So, on the one hand, it's considered shameful for you to talk about your own body and sexuality, let alone even speak the word rape. On the other hand, the woman has to graphically describe her body and the act of rape to prove that she is not lying, and the defense lawyer exploits this. The belief that rape is worse than death, an ultimate violation of the self. So, no matter whether the guy has a knife or whatever, you won't try to save your life, you will try to save your honor. So, you should have lot of marks of resistance on your body, otherwise these judges are not going to believe you. So, judges have looked for marks of resistance, otherwise they have said women are liars. So, in the ultimate analysis, the rape trial is not a means of communicating the violence of rape. Instead, by mimetically reenacting the rape, it sexualizes the woman's body. And the experience of testifying, characterized as re-rape, is more than just a metaphor to describe the way law's violence is inscribed on the body. For example, in the Rajasthan High Court, during the cross-examination, the victim was asked as to which posture in which she was raped. So she was asked to lie down on a bench and say, show us how were you raped. Here it is not sufficient that a woman must talk in public of her breast, her vagina, her anus, and of course what the accused did to these parts and with what parts. And then there is a stipulation to recall in photographic exactitude what happened, questions about the duration of the rape, position, depth of penetration, direction of emissions, chronology of events. All these questions produce extreme forms of humiliation. I won't read out this long quote, but there was in July 2012, there was an appeal heard in the Gujarat High Court, for example, in which the victim had been asked about duration, whether the accused had ejaculated, where he had ejaculated, whether she bit the accused, grabbed his hair, kicked him. Now, ejaculation has no evidentiary value, right? I mean, it doesn't matter whether the guy ejaculates or not. Yet, over in 2011, there's a case from Bombay where the judge is saying ejaculation is not legally relevant. But why did the defense lawyer not ask questions about it? So he wanted to know how many times, where, how, and everything. So there's a way in which courtroom talk is organized, which doesn't translate in the record of the court. So a victim may be asked 10 questions, but only one line will be translated. So if we only study High Court or Supreme Court judgments, we don't get a sense of what are the nature of courtroom talk and what kind of questions the survivor has been asked. Now, one of the central arguments of the book is that the medicalization of consent and falsity is the defining feature of rape trials in India. I trace the emergence of medico-legal categories through what is known as a two-finger test. You haven't heard of it, okay. So basically, doctors have been since the British ka zamana practicing this method of determining whether a woman is used to sex or not. So they insert 2 fingers or 3 fingers in a woman's vagina to see whether the hymen is distensible or not. Based on that, in their MLC, medical legal certificate, they'll write 2 fingers, 1 finger easily admissible, 2 fingers admissible or whatever, or they may write used to sex, habituated to sexual intercourse. So the minute a prosecutor sees an MLC in front of him before the trial, he says habituated. Then to habituated che. This woman is habituated and you cannot believe her, right? So it prejudices the woman's testimony even before the trial, right? So it is one of the most primitive forms of truth technology deployed on women's bodies. So what I want to do is I want to give you one of you said you watched Satyamay Jayate, and there was a discussion around the medical textbooks and whatever. So I want to sort of flesh out that story a bit. The commonplace insistence that most complaints of rape are false, and to prove rape, women's bodies should bear marks of stiff resistance, was foundational to the establishment of colonial medical jurisprudence in India. So there were works by medical jurists such as Taylor, Baines, Cheevers, Leon, Modi, not your chief minister, but another Modi who was also from Ahmedabad, who not merely medicalized the suspicion towards raped women, but consolidated the role of medical experts in colonial India. So medicalization of falsity was a specific kind of collaboration between law and medicine in early 19th century England. So experts defined rape as a moral problem which tainted its victims more than her assailant. The colonial law on rape in India was modeled on such efforts to regulate the chastity of all women, which specifically acted to control the sexuality of working class women in England. Now, the project of medical jurisprudence in colonial India was ethnological. It marked difference by constituting the native us guys, as lying, licentious, seductive, or inherently criminal. So Norman Chevers, who was a civil surgeon in the colonial administration, he's often referred to as the father of medical jurisprudence in India. He said, "It is only by thoroughly knowing the people and fixing the mind upon the records of their crimes that a European can learn how strange a combination of sensuality, jealousy, wild superstition, absolute untruthfulness and ruthless disregard of the value of human life lie below the placid, civil, timid exterior of the natives of India." Chevers assumed that the belief in a woman's virtue or man's virtue, honesty, does not exist amongst Indians. He opined that the instances of rape appear to be of great frequency in India, and there is also reason to believe that persons are by no means rarely falsely charged with this commission. So every significant medico-legal textbook begins with an introduction to the medical expert to look for signs of false cases of rape. The paradigmatic statement that false charges of rape are not uncommon in India finds various repetitions in various versions of Modi's medico-legal textbook. So the guy died somewhere in the 1940s, I forgot the exact date, but then they carry on the title of the book and various people keep on revising the book, and the book is like really important for in courts. It's the scientific voice. So even judges do not challenge the science in these books. So what's happened is there's all this colonial part, and then they add recent stuff on HIV, AIDS or whatever, NAS Foundation judgment, and they read these two things together. So they'll say false cases, but it's a human rights violation together. And it's very constitutive of the way in which defense lawyers talk and think in courtrooms. So I just want to read out a few excerpts from Modi. Modi in 1922 says, which continues till 2011. In the majority of rape cases of an adult woman, the charge is made with the object of blackmail, or the act is done with the consent of the woman, but when discovered to get herself out of trouble, she does not have any scruple when she accuses the man of rape. If the complaint is made a day or two after the act, the case is one which is probably false, and so on and forth. Then he says, false charges are not uncommon in India. Occasionally parents may induce chilies in the vagina of their female daughter to cause irritation and inflammation with the purpose of bringing a false charge of rape to take against somebody they want to take revenge from or extort money on, and they tutor their children to do so. Here we see a concern with simulation of rape rather than constituting the act of objects or chilies into the child's vagina as sexual violence itself, as a form of sexual assault itself. Further, rape victims were believed to inflict injuries upon themselves. So there used to be like separate section on self-inflicted injuries. For example, to substantiate false charges, marks of violence and sometimes self-inflicted. Once this is Modi saying in 1922, saw a young woman of 20 alleged to have been raped by a man who made several marks simulating scratches with a conker on the forearms and the chest, which could be rubbed off by a wet cloth. And there are various versions of this that people use starch to simulate semen. They kill frogs, that was one. They kill frogs to simulate blood and so on and so forth. The other kind of bias is towards, what kind of woman can be raped. So the British were very confused about, can you be raped when you are sleeping? Can you be raped if you are hypnotized? So there is a whole taxonomy of various mental states or physical states women are, and whether it is possible in nature to do that. So early 19th century British medical textbook legitimized men's claim that women consented to violence repeating the common belief that no man could rape a healthy adult woman by himself. And in Mirzapur court also, there are very many lawyers saying, you don't understand, women have the natural ability to cross their legs, and you cannot rape a woman. Like, it's not possible in nature. You try doing it with a woman friend, you will come to know. So I was like, achha. This proposition finds elaboration in colonial medical textbooks and up till now about whether women can be raped at all, if they can be, under which circumstance. So you have the construction of the normal able-bodied woman versus a woman who is drugged, hypnotized, stupefied, sleeping, insane, gagged, and able-bodied. So 1969 edition of Modi, which I'm just citing different years, but please assume it continues until today. So it is assumed that a woman belonging to a laboring class who is accustomed to hard and rough work will be able to offer a great deal of resistance and to deal blows on her assailant, and will thus succeed in frustrating his attempts at violation. On the contrary, a woman belonging to a middle class, rich, of educated family, you have to be educated also, and not habituated to go about by herself, will not be able to resist and soon faint or will be rendered powerless from fright or exhaustion, right. And some medico legal textbooks also say you have to be fair, like, you know, if you are fair, then you will faint. So laboring bodies can resist, fight and are able bodied. Upper class bodies are flaccid, educated, fair, docile. Context of poverty, illness, survival do not characterize this working class body. So we see how medicalization of falsity also organizes a difference on the grounds of age, marital status, caste, tribe, class, in order to convert coercion into consent. The second major argument which I make is around medicalization of consent, which will bring me back to the two-finger test. So Anna Clark's brilliant analysis of the rape law in the 19th century England reveals that British trials involving children, even those younger than 12 years, permitted evidence of their general indecency. Newspaper accounts portrayed children's testimony as malicious. Medical experts who medicalized falsity repeatedly maintained that working class or poor parents, and especially mothers, were the ones who injured and tutored their young children into levying false cases for the purpose of extortion. And this kind of colonial assumption you see at work in our courts today, and one of my chapters sort of narrates this kind of distrust of the mother. In his lecture on rape, French medical jurist Thoineau instructed his students, and he said, "Remember that every time you find yourself as an expert in the presence of a child supposed to be a victim of an assault, you should be on your guard. Distrust should be, in cases of this kind, the first rule of examination." So in the 19th century, medical experts in Britain were very confused. They were like, is it possible in nature for a child who was below the age of consent, was at 10 at that time, that is how they defined child at that time, whether it was possible to rape, that is complete penetration of the vagina by the penis, was possible by an adult man in the case of a child below the age of 10 years. Surgeons testified in English courts it is not possible to rape a child, and it also led to an acquittal of one man accused of this crime. However, by 1844, Taylor began to say that it should not be assumed that all the charges of rape on these young children are frivolous and therefore impossible. And what Taylor does is he turns to Cheever. By this time, Cheever has written a medical legal textbook on India, and he has found that in the instance of child wives, there are instances of rape and death. If you remember the Fulmani Dasi case, it finds a lot of sort of elaboration in the medical jurisprudence textbooks. So, the death of child wives in India is then used to in England. So, the knowledge goes back. So, if India was constructed as the lab, as it were, so that knowledge flows back to England to establish that no, it's possible in nature, and so then they begin to change their position, and that reflects in the medical. So, colonial medical jurisprudence as an ethnological project also treated raped bodies of native children as specimens in a lab, and they actually have a museum in Calcutta where they put up the lacerated vagina of a young Muslim girl, showing the effects of violence on the vagina on display, right. So, at this time the category of partial penetration emerges. So, they say ki okay, theek hai, if there is no complete penetration, in order for us to be to recognize that children can be raped, let us recognize that partial penetration. If there is evidence of partial penetration, then we will recognize that the child has been raped. So, this is when the category of partial penetration emerges. But in the case of partial penetration, they accept the fact that the hymen may remain intact. Until now, they were all concerned with virginity, rape as an offense against virginity, they were concerned about the hymen. But suddenly doctors discover that the hymen can be lacerated because of number of reasons. One of the common reasons they cite is riding a bicycle. Apparently, a lot of women were riding bicycles in India during colonial regime. So, that is one cause, because of accidents, because of various other things. So, then they say that look, they start developing taxonomies of different kinds of hymens, and basically they say that there are false virgins and true virgins, right. So, you may have a hymen which is elastic. So, you may have had sex, but does not do anything to the hymen, right. So, now they are very puzzled. If the hymen is not a reliable indicator, what should we do? So, then they invent this two-finger test. They insert glass pipettes, measuring cones, 2 fingers in the vagina, and you find references to this in Modi as well. And the 2 fingers are supposed to approximate or mime, and I'm not going to read out these passages, I can send them to you if you want me to. But basically the idea was that a body of the size, I am reading out a quote from Modi, a body of the size of the penis in erection could perfectly well pass through the hymenal orifice without rupturing it once or several times. So, the 2 fingers mimes this. So, you can then distinguish a true virgin from a false virgin, even if the hymen is intact. So, the relationship that is drawn between the clinical 2-finger test and the erect penis is one of mimesis. The line between the 2-finger test as a surgical or clinical procedure and assault is a thin one from the point of view of the survivor, whether or not consent is taken by the survivor. But if you refuse consent, they say, oh, she must be lying, she refused to submit to the doctor's examination. The consent is an empty category in this. So, state-sponsored medical jurisprudence then invents such a clinical test precisely because it measures injury against itself rather than against victim. The object of diagnosis is not the harm caused to the survivor of rape, but how phallocentric society is injured by the act of rape. So, Tuana's legacy in conclusion continues to haunt rape trials in India despite several different petitions by different women's groups and health right groups to protest against the sexist and racist assumptions that underlie medical jurisprudence. There has been change, but change has been slow. in this field, the work of Sehat, an organization in Bombay, has been remarkable. They've started working with 3-4 hospitals, trying to develop a protocol, but they've had to, it's been a huge struggle, and this was the two-finger test. The critique of the two-finger test was visibilized by a fantastic report in 2010 by the Human Rights Watch, and was a very huge part of the campaign after the Delhi protests. But I am sorry to tell you that the government still hasn't scrapped it, despite a Supreme Court judgment in April 2014 which said that this test is unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court didn't ban it themselves. They didn't say that you can't use it. And and then many other related problems in hospitals, for example. The other, so it's the two-finger test, the hymen, and old tears versus fresh tears. So if you have old tears, then they assume that you're habituated to sex. So I move away in my work from the view that appellate law up there in High Court, Supreme Court is real law. And I privilege the trial court as a site of inquiry to elucidate how law can be localized so that it bears little resemblance to the rule or the doing of the rule. Those aspects of trial that do not enter juridical records detail ways in which the violence of state law is written on women's bodies. Lawyers' law then is not exhausted by legal norms provided in law books or published judgments, or by describing a gap between law and its implementation, right? So nowhere is written that you should use lie detection tests on rape survivors. So why did the Forensic Science Lab in Ahmedabad admit to me that they were using lie detection methods on rape survivors, right, rather than the accused? And lie detection tests per se are problematic, but so it's not only a question of the gap between the law and its implementation. Law reform does not always address the injuries of spoken law, nor does it address the manifold conventions of law in different sites. So I have highlighted the criminal trial as a site where there are different kinds of expert knowledges which converge to produce different effects of power and knowledge. While it is never easy to bring about legislative or juridical change, the changes that are demanded need to be further grounded in an understanding of the practice of law as it's dispersed over these different sites, hospitals, forensic science labs, police stations, and so on and so forth. Thank you for listening to me.
Have questions?
Sure. Comments?
Questions, comments?
I have two questions. You're supposed to be answering questions, Preeta.
Okay, it's on. No, I mean, I think I just would start with a comment that this book is not like, it covers so many different things in so much detail, and Pratiksha has just kind of given us a very brief overview of the things that are in it. I really want to say thanks to her for writing this book. There's nowhere at present, apart from this book, where we have a detailed history of rape reform law in India from the beginning to end. That's just one chapter. We don't have anywhere how a child witness is treated in the kind of detail with the case law that's present here. As a lawyer who's managing a group of lawyers, and as somebody who's trying to fight for gender justice, this book will be really useful for me, Pratiksha. I would just like to add to the idea that you were saying about being habituated, meaning that, the forensic thing, meaning whether they were habituated to sex or not. To also take it into saying that how also if you're habituated to sex, it doesn't mean that you can't be raped. But that, legally, there's a difference between being habituated to sex and still being able to be raped. And the assumption that, is made that if you have had sex, then you're not rapeable. Wives cannot be raped. women. So one of the points made in the open letter by the open letter that Pratiksha talked about is that the strong social norm we have of premarital sex. What meditated against Mathura was also the fact that if you're a woman and not married and you've had sex, then you're not rapeable. I mean, that's also the kind of social norm that I think is really problematic.
It's just a comment, but so there's this general perception that if it's rape, then it has to be women. So I think probably if you could talk about it a little more, write a piece on it or something, about how rape is not just constricted to women and girls. It has to be, it's a very big thing. It's basically a bodily violation. So there is an entire amount of other kind of discrimination that happens against men who are being raped. There are aspects of, you know, macho and machismo. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but yeah. But that's just a comment.
Thank you. Should we collect a few questions?
Sure. How does the new, the amendments to the law after the recent events change the law? I mean, are there some things which could result in unanticipated, impossibility of dealing with rape in the future? That's one question. So generally you could tell us a little bit more about what happens with the changes in the law. The other thing I found problematic in your diagnosis, it's one-sided and it's probably necessary to highlight the colonial origins of, the absurdities in the rape law. But, your very treatment of the cases did point to something more than just the law, and the significant biases, the significant, let us say, errors, or at least the way we would look at it in modern terms, in our own culture and sociology. Okay. Now, why are we ignoring, for instance, the huge negatives and the treatment of rape from a modern perspective, which is there in our own religion, in Manusmriti, in the culture, in, for instance, the macho culture of northern India, which have all contributed to the interpretation and the practice among rape lawyers and judges, more than the law. See, if after all the British could have moved away from this to something reasonable today, I hope it is, I'm just assuming it is, then the question is not so much what the law was, but how you change it and why it wasn't changed thus far. Okay. Second thing is, I think it does make sense to look at the law in comparative terms, because I'm not so sure that the problem lies only in the origin, because when you do so, you externalize it. You say that this is what the British did, quite like a lot of left-wing scholars would say. India is poor because the British exploited. Absolutely true, but useless because you can't do much about it. You have to do something yourself. Okay. So why is it that the right kind of moves are not being made? And even when they are, it leads to other kinds of distortion. Let me give you an example from criminal law, the Evidence Act. Okay. Indian police have the highest rate of crime for any particular group. Okay. As a result, their evidence was inadmissible. Became inadmissible. Now that results in absurdities in terms of manufacture of evidence. Now you don't have that kind of a knee-jerk reaction to a problem in the way the police are governed, managed and administered, and not so much in the law. So you ended up changing the law, and then now it's become even worse. Okay. So you could have those kind of problems coming if you go about it seeing it as a problem in law alone. Okay.
Okay. Maybe I'll, yeah. Thank you very much for all your really thought-provoking and clarificatory questions. So the new, I'll take your questions together because in a sense they are connected. So the issue of violence on men and transgendered people, etc., has had a very complicated, heated, passionate discussion between women's groups, queer rights groups, and the government was on a completely different planet, right? But they were all debating this category of gender neutrality, right? So the ordinance which came into place before the new law in February was gender neutral completely for victims and perpetrators. But they added this exception that you cannot, women cannot complain of marital rape. But not, there was no similar bar for men. So if you make a law totally gender neutral with this kind of exception, then it means men can accuse their wives of sexual assault. Logically, that's what it means, right? So the kind of notion that the government had of gender neutrality didn't seem to be, it was like if women can accuse, then men should be also, like, tit for tat kind of thing. But it was not animated with a concern for protecting the rights of queer citizens. In the Verma committee report, you had a definition where gender specificity of the perpetrator was maintained. So, perpetrator would always be a man, and gender plurality was extended to victims. So, it could be man, woman, transgender, whosoever, right? Where the identity, gendered identity, otherwise what happens is there was some debate about should you have a different law for gay people, transgendered people and whatever, but then the difficulty there is that you have to prove your gendered identity through all these very medicalized and very dubious kind of cases. If you remember the Pinky Pramanik case, I don't know if you read about it, but it raises a lot of problematic kind of issues. So basically the position they said men and persons as victims, right? And there was some degree of angst about the use of the category of persons, but there was some kind of a uneasy consensus between various groups working on this issue. But in response, the government, when it enacts the Criminal Law Amendment Act, drops gender neutrality altogether. And it's been a huge disappointment because for the first time the issue of sexual violence on adult men in everyday context, not just in conflict or custodial settings, was beginning to get recognition, not just children. Children up till age of 18, men and girls and boys both are covered, or young adults are covered. But beyond the age of 18, rape of men is still unrecognized, which was a huge, and then the story with 377 sort of set back the gains of so many years. The Criminal Law Amendment Bill Act is a complicated piece of legislation which has been sort of welcome for moving away from the definition of peno-vaginal definitions. So, it's expanded the range of ways in which women can be raped, right? And it hasn't sort of distinguished between one kind of penetration as being less serious or than other. So, penile penetration and being penetrated forcibly by something else has been put at par, right? You get the same kind of punishment. So, that's been characterized as a progressive change, which should change the meanings of sexual violence as a violation of any kind of bodily, like as a harm which women face, not something which is not linked to patriarchal notions of descent or and so on and so forth. The category of custodial violence has been expanded to include army, to include riots, communal violence, but the proposal to sort of remove the impunity and immunity granted by ASPA was not accepted. So that stays. Sorry. On the other hand, the age of consent was increased to 18. So one fears that the regulation of women who want to get married of choice, and the age bracket between 16 and 18, now that sphere has expanded. And since the discretion of sentencing has been earlier, judges could give adequate and special reasons to lower sentences. Now they can't, because they were using it to lower sentences, and they were not even giving the minimum mandatory sentence. So the legislative change sort of comes from that judicial experience as well. So there are people who are saying that the sentencing structure is very stringent, But you know, the law's just been enacted and we have to see what judges do with this law and what the police does with this law as well. I'm sorry if my presentation suggested that I'm trying to trace an origin. That's not what I'm trying to do. I have presented to you a very partial part of the chapter, and maybe that it lends itself to that kind of reception. But you know, when I was doing my field work here, I kept on hearing habitually and seeing how this Modi structures the defense, and I have excerpt in that same chapter as to how the very structure of the textbook, it is constitutive of the trial, the way the defense lawyer is asking questions, to ask questions to the gynecologist or whoever else, right. Of course, we have interpreted, expanded, and how should I say, given it, it's embedded, these texts and law is embedded in our, in cultures of courtrooms, it's also determined by the bureaucracy of the courtroom or case. So there are very many multiple factors. I'm not trying to suggest that it's just because the British imported, rather I was just trying to trace the genealogy of the category, because I want to understand what does this mean, what does it mean. So now doctors, even if they have a pregnant woman, insert 3 or 4 fingers in the vagina of a pregnant woman. See, it is at the level of a medical practice, which is obviously sort of inflected by social attitudes towards sexual violence survivors, as well as this history. So it's like I'm trying to say that, you know, law and science is inflected by the social, and trying to map it out in these, and law and science comes together in the trial. Peter, do you want to say anything about the new law? Yeah.
I think, as Pratiksha said, you know, if you read the book, actually she focuses a lot on the feminist movement, how it has challenged things from the open letter which she talked about in 1983 to various battles that the feminist movement and the women's movement has fought, and it has informed the changes in the law. So we are very much involved in trying to change the law. In fact, at Pratiksha's book launch, Vrinda Grover was actually making a point that we should, this book is too melancholic, we should feel very good that we have brought about these changes in the law and the kind of hope that the law now has. And to going back to some of the changes that we brought about, as Pratiksha was talking about the Mathura case, how they read consent as being a lack of resistance. Now the law clearly defines, it's written that consent cannot be the fact that there is no marks of resistance. So that's our advocacy, the feminist movement's advocacy, that has led to those kind of changes in the law, which clearly defines what consent cannot be. We also have an affirmative standard of consent now. Before, consent was not defined. It was left for the judges to decide. Now it's a very affirmative standard in that the accused have to prove why they believe there was consent. So it isn't going to be enough that there is resistance or she didn't say no. It has to be proved that there's a yes. That could be by words or behavior. So that's a marked shift in the law, right? And it's informed by the experiences of the women's movements who've been fighting. I mean, there have been many battles, court battles like the Sakshi case that was fought, which led to the Law Commission report. There's a long history. I mean, this is why I'm congratulating Pratiksha, because in her first chapter, she actually sets out that reform, those battles that the feminist women have fought, the feminist debates, the literature. It's a monumental achievement what she's done. I would really recommend all of you to read it.
Forgive me my ignorance in case my question is not correct. I was just wondering about the commensurate progress in forensic science and investigation mechanisms that need to accompany this new law.
Right.
Does that happen? is there any mechanism in law or the process of investigation? Secondly, the conduct in the courtroom, the conduct of lawyers, judges in the courtroom. What you explained about the way in which the rape survivor is treated in the courtroom, the defense, the culture of defense in rape trials, it's well known, and the way in which it is almost like another rape. So do you expect that this amendment will change that culture, or will the judges be able to kind of regulate that kind of defense behavior? What do you think?
Thank you. Those are excellent questions. Thank you very much. In terms of the change in medico-legal textbooks, for example, that we sort of recently succeeded in inaugurating a conversation with a judge who is going to revise Modi's next textbook. So the idea, I mean, so we held a conference and where we sort of critiqued these chapters, and we said that we need more contemporary experience of even the medical profession. Like there have been so much sexual violence in this country, you've had an exceptional, I have not spoken about conflict, but in Shopian, in Gujarat, in Delhi, wherever else, you have this kind of medical experience of doctors who have looked and collected evidence in the situation of mass conflict, in everyday kind of, so that experience needs to reflect in a sensitive way towards sexual violence survivors. There's been immense work done with Sehat and other organizations on developing a medical protocol as to how you should, how you should record, how you should interview, what kind of swabs you should collect. They brought out a rape kit, and so things like one of the examples which was given to us was we need to collect nails. They don't have sometimes in the emergency ward a nail cutter, right? And so the delay happens because you don't have a nail cutter. So this rape kit has things like that, which enables you for doctors to collect. For example, one thing which hasn't happened to my continuing distress is rape survivors have to give up their clothes for forensic analysis. But the state doesn't give you a spare change of clothes. So Vrinda Grover in JNU narrated the story of one of her clients who was an American tourist who was raped when she was jogging. And basically she goes to the cop station and the police tell her, give us your trousers, and she's like, what do you think, I'm going on a jog, I think that I'm going to be raped, I'll be carrying a spare clothes with me, right? So they gave her a dirty blanket to wear. So these are very important things. They may seem small. They're working class women who may not be able to afford to give up their only pair of sari or whatever it is, right? But we do not have, unlike other countries. Other countries have rape crisis centers, they have sexual assault forensic nursing as a specialization. We don't have this kind of nursing or this kind of support work, and maybe Dr. Baxi can tell us how, you read this as MBBS students when you're a student, and then suddenly you are in the emergency and you deal with these cases, right? And one of the survivors, for example, narrated to me that she was not only being examined, but all the interns were also watching the examination. So there is no specialized training. There is specialization, there is not a market for it. Right? And even in the private sector, now the law mandates all hospitals to look after sexual assault survivors. But earlier, you could only go to a government hospital. You could not go and see any witch doctor, right? So there has been some work, and now sexual violence is at least emerging as a public health issue. Just as reproductive health emerges as a public health issue, sexual violence did not similarly emerge as a public health issue, but it is a health issue, right? So the therapeutic part of it is beginning to influence or emerge with, supplement the forensic science part of it, because right now you just treat the woman's body as evidence, and that also you don't do well, right? The second part is more difficult. I think there's a lot of thinking to be done on how do we change the ways in which judges or lawyers, because judges also do the questioning, right? How in courtrooms. So one of the standard reform strategy has been judicial training. So for judges, there is a whole judicial academy, and in various court complexes after these, especially after these protests, there have been like judicial training or whatever. But sometimes it depends on what kind of judicial training you're doing. There are different genres. So sometimes you teach a particular kind of politically correct language to the judiciary. So remember, there was a judge who'd been trained, very progressive judge in the Gujarat High Court, but he'd been trained in the Warwick gender justice, gender judicial training, whatever it was called, on rape issues. So very, very good answers, responses to, you know, we have to understand women's bodies. I don't think we should be recording this. We have to understand women's bodies, and women menstruate. You can't ever go to court and say, I am in a lot of pain, I am menstruating, please give me muddat, give me a date. I can't argue the case because they just assume everybody's bodies is neutral, like whatever. So, so he was very, he sort of, but when I asked him about a father, like why do fathers rape their children kind of things, he said to me, it's because the wife can't satisfy her husband, so he turns towards the child. So, you know, that entire gender training sort of went for a 6 at that moment, right? So, you may learn a very progressive language, but you may not really understand what is it that you are critiquing, right? And the operations of power. Is something to add?
After you finish.
So, courtroom culture, so Preeta is doing trainings with lawyers, and in the West, they've done projects with the DAs of the prosecutor's office, and you need sustained work because these are worldviews. So while judges in the trial court and lawyers in the trial court are more sociological, they have a sense of how the law is being used, and very interesting people, very intelligent also at times, because you have to work with them on a sustained group, and unfortunately we don't have too many groups working with prosecutor's office in district court. In fact, people don't even go and research district courts, they only research high courts, Supreme Court judgments.
I'd just like to add 2 points to what the teacher said. One is that we now have a law, we've had a law since November, do I hit that? Okay, we've had a law since November 2012, which is about protecting children from sexual offences, and that has really changed. I mean, it's totally changed the face of sexual violence against children, and that law does say that aggressive cross-examination is not allowed. It produces a whole protocol. The judges have to ask the questions, defense lawyers. I mean, Pratiksha's book shows, I think it should be given as evidence, you know, to all the high court judges as to the kind of cross-examination that has taken place in child cases. In child cases. So it says this is, but the problem is the fact that law has changed. Does that mean the practice will? So the law says that the defense lawyers have to give the questions to the judges will ask the questions, the kids should have frequent breaks, they should not, you know, their needs should be looked into, there should be special courts, there should be special prosecutors. 18 months, 16 months after the law, it's after people have started pushing for it that the special courts, it also says there should be special courts for children. They've only just been notified. How long it will take to get the prosecutors and then train them. And also you see the matter of training. Today I was talking to the social defense officer this morning about how they train protection officers who deal with domestic violence law. They said, हाँ हमने तो training कर दी है. तो मैंने पूछा, हाँ आप कितने लोगों को train किए? 100 लोग थे. They think they'll do a 1-hour training for 100 people. और बहुत magistrate भी आए थे. And that's it, done for the next 5 years. I said, you know, you have to do training in groups of 25. It has to be repeated. That kind of thing has not been, that's what she's talking about, the sustained training has not happened. Just another point, whilst we're talking about forensic techniques and all of it being very important, which it is, but also to remember that, you know, there are many times when there can be no forensic medical evidence. So for example, now digital penetration will constitute rape. What forensic medical evidence can you get for that? What forensic medical evidence will you get for oral penetration? So, but you know, people need to be sensitized because women will still be sent for forensic, even if they say, and this has happened in Bombay, they're saying that the assault is an oral sexual assault, they're still sent for the, there's nothing that, you know, the forensic science can do in that instance.
One sort of small question about your research experience. In terms of your role as a researcher, you mentioned there were many obstacles for you to get sort of access to people, for them to talk to you. But could you say a little bit about how indeed you got access? How did you start conversation? How did you sustain them? And since you have a lot of rich primary data as well in your conversations with lawyers, with district court magistrates and others, so could you say a little bit more about how did, you know, how did you eventually, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that question actually. I got permission to research rape trials, but I had to state that I was a law student. So if I was told, because at that time there was a very strange case or allegation of rape which was very, very politicized at that time, and it was alleged that this young woman had gone into a prison in Ahmedabad, and basically then she said that the person who was in charge of the prison had raped her, and she'd gone stating that she's a sociologist. And I came to Ahmedabad at the same time, and it was very, very politicized, the ISI, Pakistan, terror. It was an incredibly complex kind of discourse around this case. So it was very strange that everybody in the High Court and the District and Sessions Court, they were like, look at that case, sociologists and researchers levy false cases against men who give them permission to do research. You are never going to get access. So it started like that. So then I was advised not to go about courts in Ahmedabad saying I'm a sociologist. Now I couldn't carry that off because I'd never seen a court in my life. I'm not a lawyer. I had to learn up my law while doing my research. So obviously this lawyer thing was not going to work. Anyway, so I went and sat in a courtroom one day to witness a rape trial, and I couldn't understand anything because 3-4 cases were simultaneous and whatever. So one middle-aged man, he sort of gestured to me, he said, follow me kind of thing. So I didn't know who he was, but I followed him, and he turned out to be the public prosecutor. So basically he adopted me into his chambers, became like one of his juniors, and one of his woman juniors became a friend, and they sort of enabled the project. So whatever cases he got, he introduced me to other prosecutors, and but even in this chamber for 1 month there was no conversation on rape cases, and I was going to quit and go. Like I was like, it's been 1 month, I'm probably not a good field worker, what is happening? And then basically one day the prosecutor takes me to the courtroom, the bigger table than this, and pulls out a file, and he says, Baxi, do you know what this is? It was a medical legal certificate. So he says, do you know what primary sexual organs are? I was like, a little taken aback. I was like, yeah, I know. Do you know what secondary sexual organs are? These are categories in the MLC, right? So I said, yes, I do. Do you know what a hymen is? I was like, yeah, and then he drew a hymen like they draw in medical legal textbooks. And by this time I was very puzzled. I was like, what's going on? So he says, come with me. So we go back to the chamber, and he tells his junior, explain it. So she nods, and she's looking very embarrassed. And she says, Pratiksha, do you know how a man rapes a woman? It is, a man can't rape a woman by kissing her. So I said, you know, do you mean partial or complete penetration? And she sighed, and she was so relieved, and she was like, yeah, that's what I mean. So basically they thought because I was unmarried, single, I did not know anything about facts of life and or about the rape law, and it was only by performing this kind of, and medico-legal jurisprudence plays a very important part in between, because men and women can talk in scientific categories with each other. I mean, it's more objective. So that was very important, which is I often feel that medico-legal languages are very important to constituting, negotiating these kind of dynamics. Otherwise, it can easily, sort of fade away into or be pornographic, constructed as pornographic. It's a short answer. Thank you.
Well, we can continue conversations informally over. Let me formally thank Dr. Baxi on behalf of the IMA community.
Thank you very much.